Good afternoon. It's my delight as Director of the RSCM Humoris to be able to welcome you to today's webinar. We know that there are a very large number of attendees for this webinar. We believe that it's in the order of 670. So you're not alone in wanting to join for the source of information that we hope we can in some part provide. So the RSCM is really pleased to be offering this webinar as we look at how best to prepare for and confront the present and the future. We are an independent charity, and we think that means we're really well placed to be able to ask the important questions of the day. And though, of course, our mission is entirely to support the work of the church, many people are surprised that actually we receive no direct funding from either the church or the state. We're reliant on our membership subscriptions and our own activities and donations to enable us to carry out the work that we do. Not everything today will result in answers. It's impossible, based on the very fast-moving situation, for that to be the case. What is the case is we can make sure that the right questions are being tabled and that people's thinking is being channeled in the right direction. To everyone who's attending, just a couple of things, that this is a public meeting and any questions and things that you submit will be recorded on our system, and I will just ask you to bear that in mind. You can ask, the questions is enabled. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen that will come in, and we will try and process those questions during the session, and our technical host Sam will help us to manage those, but we will do our best to answer the questions, although we already have a number of course to work through. The webinar is being recorded and we will make it available in an appropriate format afterwards. Today the content is intended to cover four main areas: looking about how we can find models that will enable the ministry of music to continue and to develop and thrive in our churches, looking at best practice for safe use of spaces and facilities, looking at something of the financial implications of what's going on, and the effect and the consequences on church communities and of musicians. And this is not just talking about the largest, grandest establishments. This is also looking about the small local ones. They're just as important. We've got a really distinguished panel available today, and we're grateful for them to be here to be able to unpack these questions. And what we're hoping is that they can help show some positive ways forward to be able to model these things. Some of the things they will cover include church thinking and service frameworks, practical thinking about opening of buildings, management of choirs and musicians, making rehearsals possible, and we know that the all-important question of accessing organs. We also have some conversations on medical issues, pragmatic and rational basis for decision making so that we get the right decisions made on the right basis at the right time. And also understanding the consequences of the current situation and ministering to it appropriately, not least remembering that the people involved are indeed people. So I'm going to briefly introduce each of the panel and they'll have a chance to say hello, and then I'm going to pass over to our chair for the actual discussion. So first of all, it's a great pleasure to welcome the Bishop of Portsmouth, the Right Reverend Christopher Foster. He's it's great to have him on board because he is, if nothing else, co-chair of the Conversations in England, Wales with the Roman Catholic Church, and he speaks nationally for the bishops on a number of matters, including economic policy and welfare, and is a member of the House of Lords. So Bishop Christopher, we're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And we look forward to what you have to say later. So we also have the Catholic Archbishop of Cardiff, the Most Reverend George Stack. He's had a number of positions before taking up his archbishop role, including Archbishop for the Diocese, Auxiliary Archbishop for the Diocese of Westminster. He's been chairman of the Diocesan Department for Education and Formation and administrator, I should say, of Westminster Cathedral and a parish priest. So we're most grateful to you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Hugh.
We have Dr. Matthew Salisbury, who is National Liturgy and Worship Advisor for the Church of England, and he has a great number of meetings I know at the moment, so we're very grateful to Matthew for being available this afternoon.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
And then we have Dr. Charlie Bell, who is National Clinical Fellow at the Health and Social Care Committee of the House of Commons, and is a fellow and lecturer at Girton College, Cambridge, and was a chorister and is an ordinand. So he knows all sorts of things about all sorts of aspects of this. Charlie, it's great to have you here.
It's very good to be here. Yes, I think I probably speak several of the different languages required for this debate, so it's good to be with you.
Multiple languages are always helpful. We also have Canon Salma McDougall. She is the RSCM's new Deputy Director for Education and Mission Delivery, and she started in that role this week. And so until last Friday, she was Precentor of Lincoln. Sal, it's great to have you in this discussion too.
Thank you, Hugh. Lovely to be here.
We also, of course, have some musicians here, and there are three of them of different kinds. So Dr. Noel Dredinik will be familiar to many people through his work, long and distinguished work at All Souls Langham Place in London, and is a regular contributor to Premier Radio and his very well-known Proms Praise. Noel, it's great to have you. Noel, are you there?
Very good to be here. I'm just struggling slightly with the technology, but I'll be back with you as soon as I can. Can you see me?
We certainly can, Noel, and we can certainly hear you. So what the technology will progress as it unfolds. Don't worry, sir. Thank you. And then we have Tom Daggett. Tom works in St Paul's Cathedral's Outreach Department and does lots of inspirational work with young people in schools and developing this vision for choir church that many of you will be familiar with and have heard about. But he works in a number of different scenarios. Tom, it's great to have you here. If you'd like to say good afternoon, that's now's your
Lovely to be with you. Thank you very much for the invitation, Hugh.
And David Price is Director of Music at Portsmouth Cathedral and about to conclude his time on RSCM Council. That's the governing body that runs the RSCM after a unique 20 years service. That's an astonishing innings. It finishes in 2 weeks' time and it will never be equalled because the rules have changed now and he can't do it. Nobody else can do it for more than 12 years. David, it's great to be here.
Thank you. That's my accolade, I think, for all time. It's the Constitution being rewritten so that I can't stand again. But I'm delighted to be here. And it's not just to represent cathedral organists, it's to look at models for how parish music can work as well.
That's it. And a lot of David's work is very, very connected to local parish circumstances. It's not just in the confines of cathedral cloisters. And then that just leaves me to the chair for today's discussion, who is the very Reverend Dr. John Hall. He is the RSCM's Chair of Council and most recently was Dean of Westminster, previously Chief Education Officer for the Church of England, and previously had also been Director of Education for the Diocese of Blackburn and a residentiary canon, and before that a parish priest. So John, sort of a formal welcome to you, but at this point I shall mute my microphone and hand over to you to lead the discussions forward. Thank you.
Hugh, thank you very much, and thank you very much for your introduction. So let's get into the discussion. It's wonderful to have so many people listening in and taking part, and you also have the opportunity to put questions and possibly to get some answers as well. But the first section of our conversation is really going to be about church thinking about services and service frameworks. And we have Bishop Christopher and Archbishop George and Matthew Salisbury, who are all going to contribute, I think, to this. So should we ask the Bishop of Portsmouth just to say a few words first?
Dr. Hall, it's very good indeed to be part of this conversation as we begin to explore together what will inevitably be a process of recovery of our church buildings and our worship in them, and indeed beyond that, a process of thinking creatively and imaginatively about how together we serve our congregations, because I think as we look forward to what I've indicated is will be a process, we'll be serving within our churches a mixed economy. When former Archbishop Rowan Williams coined that phrase, I don't think he could possibly have imagined the way in which we might use it today, because we'll be serving a congregation of, as yet we don't know what size or when it'll be able to come together, but a congregation in our buildings, but also a congregation of those who can't attend for a variety of reasons, who will be continuing to reach virtually, and a further congregation of those who want to worship and who want to engage musically, but who aren't connected to the internet and are at home with at most a phone line. So that's the challenge that I think we all need to face and to work together to meet.
Thank you very much. And Archbishop George, it'd be very good to hear from you as well. You need to unmute.
What do I need to do?
There you are. You're fine now. You can speak.
I'm fine now, am I good?
Yes.
Well, I'll just add to what Christopher said a little bit. First of all, I think perhaps all of us in the church regret being placed in the fourth category of importance, in inverted commas, by the government, and in the fourth category for possible reopening, because that says something, we think, about the perception of the service and the place of the church in the common life. We regret that, but like all law-abiding citizens, we've gone along with closure of churches and acceptance of the government categorization. One of the reasons why people are now beginning, first of all, to break the lockdown because of the mixed messages we're receiving, and also the increasing demand that churches be open. One of the reasons for that is obviously their devotion, their love of the buildings, their wish to use them for private prayer, etc., etc. But what people do not understand is that if there is going to be a reopening of churches, in our case, what we've pushed so far is for private prayer. You can come in individually, but whether there are going to be services is another question further down the line. But even on the opening for private prayer, this can't be without condition. For example, the social distancing, the health and hygiene, the control of numbers, etc., etc. And who is going to make all that provision? Not just the provision of hand gel and gloves and masks, but controlling access. Is it going to be a sort of Tesco-like queue, one in, one out? Whereas we know that once people get into churches, cathedrals in particular, for private prayer, it's very difficult to move them on.
It seems to me that the virus is beginning to fade away now, and that there seems to be some talk about the 4th of July being a date for
That's right.
opening of churches.
That's right.
But how that will work is a question, it seems to me.
Absolutely. Now, Cardinal Vincent Nichols is on a think tank, a government think tank, discussing the ramifications of opening churches and cathedrals and what will need to be in place in order to ensure that they remain safe for people coming and going. Those proposals, that protocol that he is presenting on our behalf hasn't been accepted, but is being used as a basis for discussion. We're trying to say to people, churches may reopen, some churches may reopen under certain conditions on July the 4th. That's not the same thing as saying that churches will be available for public worship.
Okay, Bishop Christopher, you've got
second phase. That's what we've picked up in England. In Wales, of course, we're still under lockdown, and the border is being built even as we speak.
Bishop,
thank you. I'm supportive of Archbishop George's reflection that it's unfortunate that church and the religious life of our nation seems often to be bracketed with the hospitality sector. The church indeed wants to be welcoming and hospitable, but we do have something distinctive and special to offer, and it will be good to be able to move progressively, as I've suggested, towards making our buildings open and available. There are a number of challenges involved, as Archbishop George has indicated. I hope that the weeks we have ahead of us before a date which is suggested to be the first Saturday in July, the earliest possible date at present, that time we can use well to prepare to address both the practical questions and the real ones, to enable us to offer the best service we can, as well as services we can, but in a way which is safe and serves the common good.
Thank you very much. Now,
John, could I just say a final word, and then I will shut up, I promise.
Please.
And Christopher and I think we're two sides of the same coin here. But could I say that the different approaches of the Church of England to the Catholic Church in the last couple of months, Anglican Church be closed and clergy not allowed access to the buildings to conduct their daily office, that's been rather sad, I think. On the other side of the coin, we have gone in big time for live streaming of private mass. And it's been an extraordinary phenomenon. And now that clergy are getting more familiar with the technology, they're becoming more confident in putting themselves forward to conduct daily mass, and certainly Sunday mass, and also devotions. And the number of viewers and the number of comments and the traffic on Facebook far exceeds the normal Sunday congregation.
That's
so
a fascinating
of the future.
That's a very fascinating insight. It means to say that presumably we're going to have to do live streaming as well as everything else.
Exactly.
Bishop Christopher.
Yeah, I agree absolutely that that clergy and indeed others who've participated in streaming have shown the sort of creativity and flexibility that is going to be needed going forward as we continue to stream and offer virtual worship and learning and study and devotion, but also the sort of flexibility and imagination we're going to need as we open progressively to public worship in our buildings.
And we had a wonderful service on Easter Sunday evening with choirs drawn from all over the place, individuals singing from their homes, creating a wonderful choir. Now I've got Matthew and Noel would like both to contribute, but Matthew first, Matthew Salisbury. Very good to have you, Matthew.
Am I audible? Yes, very good. I think I'd just like to echo these very positive words from Archbishop Stack and Bishop Foster. There are some surveys going on at the moment in various contexts, including our Church of England weekly national services, to try and get some sense of the people who are turning up. And although the surveys haven't been running for very long at the moment, there are some very interesting results, including the fact that a significant number of people who are coming to those services, tuning in on YouTube or Facebook, attend church once a month or less frequently, and a further proportion never go to church at all. So there is a sense in which, to an extent, this form of outreach is probably here to stay, and that would be a good thing. Right. If there's any silver lining to being separated from our worshipping congregations, it is perhaps this sense that we've been forced, as it were, into exploring these new forms of outreach. The other thing I wanted to say about guidance from the perspective of the Church of England, we obviously need to adhere completely to the government guidelines that are in force from time to time, and for us, that's a matter of considering how those government guidelines relate to the diverse landscape of our churches. That's undoubtedly true for the Roman Catholic Church in England as well. We've got 16,000 churches. Each one of them is different and has different physical characteristics, has different musical practices. We run the gamut from robed choirs in stalls to music groups in specially built facilities. And good practice for music in worship that is safe is going to have to incorporate the wide variety of these contexts. So the group assembling this guidance and thinking about how the government's advice needs to be implemented is thinking about the widest possible range of scenarios.
Matthew, there are quite a lot of questions around, how long will it be before a choir can be together singing as a choir? Do they have to wait for 3 months or 6 months or something before they can do that? Or is that going to happen rather earlier than we might otherwise have supposed? Matthew, do you have, Noel and David are going to speak in a moment, but Matthew, do you have a view about that?
I wouldn't want to put a number on it at this stage, but as some other speakers have indicated, it may not be the same in every possible context.
Okay.
The dates being described are the earliest possible dates, but a large basilica-style church with sparse furnishings that can be moved around might be in a very different position to a small church with box pews. But I mean, I wouldn't want to put a date on it at this stage.
Okay, Noel, you had a question or point you wanted to make.
To bring in a historical perspective just at this stage. And then maybe David wants to comment on whether it's 2021 and how much breath you assume and the spreading of germs as you sing. But the historical perspective is that 20 years ago, the archbishops commissioned a church music commission in tune with heaven. And that was chaired by a former Bishop of Portsmouth and had a secretary whose surname was also Salisbury, Patrick Salisbury. And it was interesting just how prophetic 20 years ago, there's a whole chapter about the church and media. And in some ways, exactly what that document was predicting then has happened and telescoped into the last 2 months that we've experienced, of now seeing the church very much through the screen, the church online, and churches getting excited about all the different potentials of their filming and their on-screen and online services. I think the advantage that cathedrals and abbeys and larger churches have, larger congregations, is that somebody can attend a service and, as it were, almost be a fly on the wall. They can stand by the pillar, they can be at the back, they can be disconnected, but taking it all in and evaluating what religion or music is to them. And of course, that has become superabundant in the fact that people can tune in from all over the world and just have a perspective of wondering and weighing up and curiosity. And it would be a shame, of course, for us to miss and to lose that whole opportunity to encourage people who are inquirers in a particular way.
That's a wonderful point. It's been one of the issues, it seems to me, over quite a long period, that people have not had that opportunity, as it were, to inquire. But you can inquire remotely is going to be a wonderful new thing. Of course, it needs to be remembered that it was in the 12th century in King John's reign that we last had a lockdown of any kind from churches of this kind, and that lasted for 5 or 6 years. But I think this is going to be over much quicker than that. David Price, organist of Portsmouth Cathedral, would you like to comment?
Yep. Thank you very much, John. I think the important thing for me today is actually how we move forward. Obviously the lockdown happened very quickly, and for obvious reasons. But we have the luxury, in a sense, of some time about how we create the next phase of music making and worship of God, and that's both a great thing and also a rather challenging thing, because it's going to be the difficult bit. The shutting bit was painful but easy. The next bit is the hard bit. And I think that's why this today is so important. It needs to be a bit of a two-way conversation, but hopefully in a minute, when we get to the next section shortly, we can start to explore how there might be some different models for different churches. It could be that some distinct churches, some cathedrals might model good practice and experiment with things so that can be rolled out to other places. But I think the important message I would want to get across today is that lots of conversations are going on to try and answer the questions I can already see popping up through the Q&A bit on this screen, and just to reassure people that that we are trying to consider lots of parameters about how choirs might function in different ways over coming months. Charlie can do the medical bit, but I know there's a great energy and a great groundswell of effort going on at the moment behind the scenes.
Thank you, David. We've got 21 questions so far. Hugh, have you picked out anything you want to ask from those questions?
There's a number of questions coming in that I've been trying to respond to, some as they go. I know lots of people are after some really positive solutions here forwards. There's a number of questions about asking about the role that music is going to play in this and what's going to be possible, and around how you adopt social distancing and things. So there's a raft of questions that probably move into the next section, and so I think there's probably a hope that at this point that we might, maybe the moment has come to move on to the next section, so folks, so that the practical implications and positive suggestions about what the art of the possible, if you will, might be a really helpful thing to pick up.
Okay, and it would be great to have the Bishop and Archbishop contributing, you know, as they'd like to as we go through. But now we're going on to part 2 then. This is practical thinking around the opening of buildings, the management of choirs and musicians, and how rehearsals can be possible. And we're delighted to have Noel Tredynick and Tom Daggett and David Price and Sal McDougall all going to comment on this area. Now, I don't know who's going to lead on. Noel, perhaps you will.
In some ways, I want to incorporate the two worlds. In other words, the screen world and the physical world of being together. And David will know better than I do about quite what the constraints are going to be about choristers, choirs meeting together. Are they likely to be spreading disease, or no more than somebody who's speaking, who speaks in a flamboyant way? But I think it would be very good to just make sure that although eventually we will return to our church buildings, it would be a great pity if we've lost the thrust that has been gained over these last whiles. And I think probably we will need to have cameras within our churches and be elements of film and filming and beaming our services with comment and with video clips and testimonies and all that sort of thing out to whoever the watching public might be worldwide. So I can't see us going back to being the same again. I think we have to now bring the media in and have a situation whereby we have live and, as it were, televised on YouTube or whatever it is, all going on at the same time.
Excellent. Tom, do you want to contribute now?
Of course, thank you. I think the shape of practical suggestions will look different for different people, but some principles for us might underpin the decisions that we take. I mean, from a school's perspective and children in our congregations, it's important that we keep the pack together, and that indeed applies to our church musicians, whether they be amateur or professional, who are involved in ministry. We need to keep them together and keep them doing what they're doing. Worship needs to be live, even if it's through this digital sphere. We're blessed with many thousands and millions of recordings, but we have highly skilled people who should still be paid to do what they are called to do. And we need to honour our traditions too. I'm slightly concerned about hymn singing in particular. And if we don't embrace the digital technology to allow us to keep people worshipping in their homes and singing, then we're at risk of losing that, particularly with children. But as a director of music, as well as being at a cathedral at St. George in the East, we're thinking of engaging people from the congregation in singing via Zoom. We had a service for Ascension Day yesterday with a priest in the church and somebody on a screen in Zoom singing from their home who is not somebody who is paid to do that. If and when we're able to have people back in for worship, well, of course we will be able to, but when we phase that perhaps, if it's in smaller numbers, it might mean we have to increase the number of masses. So that adds a question around who might be providing music for that. Maybe that's an opportunity to reach out to individuals in our congregations who are instrumentalists, who are able to play, and to broaden with creativity and partnership the type of music making that we are able to.
Thank you, Tom. Hugh, you've been looking at some of the questions that people are asking. People are asking really practical questions about what can we do. So Hugh,
David, I was just going to suggest to you, John, that you might ask of David and perhaps Charlie. We were in this meeting together on Wednesday, looking about how things like hymn singing and things might in fact be possible. It might be good to ask one or two of those to respond, to pick up Tom's comment there.
Thank you, David.
Yes, I think one of the best pieces of advice I would give is not to be too depressed or even too enthused in some cases by all the headlines which go on social media, because they're all about anecdotes rather than really hard peer-reviewed evidence. And Charlie again would say more about this. The jury's still out on lots of things, and I still believe, and we seem to be being advised that there are ways of mitigating risk, and hopefully the guidance which will come out from the C of E in particular will be an enabling piece of guidance. I mean, the words that were used to us in a meeting earlier in the week were about being not prescriptive, about enabling people to do things within a risk assessment and proportionate to the risk. So for instance, people should be thinking about using small singing ensembles. I'm not saying that would be immediately possible in July, but the more we think about things and the more we plan these things, the easier it will be when somebody suddenly stands up in number 10 or wherever and says you can open from the day after tomorrow. And so I think the really important thing is modelling and thinking how you can use your particular space. For cathedrals, for instance, we're thinking if our choristers who might be, not in all scenarios, but might be in one school, it would be rather perverse if they were allowed to be doing some singing in school, but weren't allowed because a particular different department in government or church says you can't do that in a church building. So there needs to be some conversations going across horizontally, not just vertically. And we're looking at trying to enable that here and in other places so that you can actually physically do some singing in buildings. It could be that we do some choristers make some music, or a very small number of back row before buildings open. Who knows? Again, I'm not saying that this potentially will happen, but if we're allowed to, it could be that we do some of the streaming in our buildings before public worship happens. And of course, some churches, not just cathedrals, some churches are large enough for you to be able to facilitate having some singers in one end of the building and the congregation in another. So I really believe there'll be some models that come out which help people look at them and say, yes, we can do this and this in our building, and apply that to their own scenario.
It's also fascinating to see what's gone on with people singing from their own rooms and everything coming together. I mean, that's the most interesting pattern. I can't see why that shouldn't happen in the future as well. Tom, do you want to contribute on that?
Yeah, I think building on Noel and Matthew's points, there are things we'll carry over, and I think we're all called to think more about individuals and in what happens during the week. So less about turning up on a Sunday morning for corporate worship. Of course, that is absolutely vital for us, but actually for the church to continue nourishing people's faith at home. And just to say that I've been very encouraged by the Church of England's Faith at Home resources, which is particular for children and families, with lots of things for them to do. And we should maybe be thinking about nourishing those in our congregation who help to lead our worship and our congregations through the week, through our wonderful use of technology.
I know that James O'Donnell at Westminster Abbey is rehearsing the boys, where from their homes. I mean, they're all doing it together, and that happens almost every day during the week. So very good development, and that could be worked out in all sorts of parish churches and cathedral communities as well. I wonder, Charlie, whether you'd like to contribute on this area for the moment.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of what I'd like to say would really be best prefaced by a bit of an investigation of the science that's underlying some of this. So I don't know if you want to hold back on that and move into the scientific area.
We'll come on to that in a moment then. But is there anyone else from the panel who wants to contribute on this area of practical, what should be actually happening, literally happening? Matthew. Unmute yourself, sir.
In the guidance that we're currently developing for the Church of England, we're having to adapt it to a number of different scenarios, depending on what the advice from the government might be, and thinking particularly about different kinds of contexts. For instance, cathedrals with choir schools might be quite different from parish churches with choirs that come from all over or from a distance. What I would encourage people to do in their own contexts would be to think about some of the possibilities. Dr. Price has already mentioned this. Think about some of the possibilities that might be possible in your own church and your own context. with the forces that you have? Do you have lots of enthusiastic instrumentalists? Do you have lots of children or adults who might be able to provide a solo contribution? And think about what might be possible, so that when we're able to make some definitive comments on the basis of what the government eventually releases, we'll all be ready. That would probably be my number one piece of advice, because that's what we're trying to do for the church in general.
Thank you, Matthew. So Hugh, and then David, and then Sal. Yes, Hugh.
So thank you, John. Just to say that, oh, hang on, no, it is open. It says open muted, but I think that's not right. So just to say, there's lots of questions saying about lots of specific things. We're not going to be able to address all of those fast enough because of the number of people in this session today. We will pick them up and put that summary document, I think, and circulate to the attendees about some of this stuff.
We've got 75 questions so far.
Yes, and it's only so fast I can type. And indeed, if the rest of them are able to answer some, they do. But
could I also say, Hugh, that it's extremely helpful to hear from everyone who's here, and we will be taking a record of all the questions. And it's incredibly helpful to have your specific queries so that we can try and feed those into the discussion as it can.
Absolutely. And what you might like, if I can reassure the audience, and you're thinking that we'd like more concrete information about the art of the possible, I think what Matthew alluded to was that there was the sense of the church is preparing guidance. It's not quite ready yet, but it's there. It's in preparation. We are working with the Church of England and other churches bodies, of course, also, to work out what that actually looks like. I had a succeeding meeting after this webinar to talk with somebody about beginning to develop the positive models so that people get the concrete information, essentially in the form of fact sheet, help sheet, advice, pointing as much as may be. We will be following up this webinar with people, offering people the kind of concrete, for instances, that I think people are sort of wondering about how they might respond to. Do bear with us if it takes us a little time to do that, because obviously it's quite a complex, intricate piece of work.
Thank you very much. David, unmute.
Apologies if this sounds like it's teaching people to suck eggs, but I didn't realize until about 3 weeks ago actually how useful, if your children that you are working with children's choirs have access to the technology, how useful it is to keep in touch with them. I mean, we all know from our work with trying to recruit children to choirs that it's a full-time job, whether you're paid for it or not. And in this particular kind of pandemic we're dealing with, keeping in touch with them is so important. And even if you only meet with them once a week via Zoom or whatever you want to use, I think that's a really important way of maintaining contact, maintaining interest. If I expect there are lots of people on here who've been doing this, and I notice actually James O'Donnell is on the list of people listening in, and John's just mentioned what he does. So rehearsals can be taken with choirs and children's groups via something like Zoom. You know, you mute everybody so that they can only hear themselves and you can only hear yourself. It's not great, but it means that everybody's doing some singing in their own home, and you're able to impart some training. So again, I'm sure lots of people are already doing that, but if you're not doing that, do consider that as a way of keeping in touch with them and also doing some music on a regular basis.
Good, thank you. Hugh and Noel, and then we're going to go to Sal after that, but Hugh.
Just to let you know that, so some people are saying this is, of course, this reliance on technology itself requires both equipment on the part of the people using it and knowledge on the people of the operatives, and saying there's a great disparity between the people who've got the time and the resource to put a lot of time into high-end edited performances and those sort of at a more local and well, in the best sense of that word, amateur level. So if I can reassure you that we are planning the next series of RSCM webinars, and we have specifically put, we had a meeting about that yesterday, it will include practical guides over the next couple of weeks coming out about how do I do some of this stuff in an achievable way at a local level without the need for really heavyweight training, because we know that people are going to need this sort of training. So we haven't yet circulated that, but we can only go so fast. It is in preparation, so if that's of some reassurance to the people watching, I hope that they will keep looking out for that. We will share that information as soon as we can.
Practical information, that's what we need. Noel, and then Sal. Noel.
When you're using Zoom, Much as church musicians love pulling the tempo around and taking time to breathe and delaying the downbeat and all that sort of thing, if you're on a Zoom, the importance really is that you keep a strict time. And it may be that actually all our timekeeping, our metronomic timekeeping will improve because of our use of Zoom. If the beat is kept absolutely solid, then you can keep everybody together. But David's right about muting certain people, but making sure as well you're not drawn into what you're listening to, but you keep a meticulous, strict time going. Then in my experience with students and with musicians, you can easily keep everybody together.
I think this practical advice is really important. Thank you, Noel. Sal.
Thank you, John. I won't take up too much time because there's some really good discussion going here, but I would just like to echo what colleagues have said about, I think one of the things we're learning here is that we're being given a new sense of what's possible, because we're seeing so much more creativity released in new ways, and I think we're probably learning that we're capable, even at local level, of much more than we realised. And certainly one of the jobs for the RSCM in the near future is to, as Hugh just said, give people the tools and the practical information which will help them to realise that creativity. And again, just to pick up what Noel said, that we're moving towards a different place. We're moving to the phrase of the moment, the new normal, where one size doesn't fit all, and picking up what colleagues have said about the importance of being ready to explore hybrid models, different kinds of making music, and modelling potential scenarios and futures. I'd like to pick up on the importance of adaptation, being prepared to adapt to whatever future we're heading for. And again, that will be different depending on where we are. The importance of conversation between those of us involved in planning worship, clergy and musicians and so on, need to talk to each other about what's possible and where we're going together. And that, I hope, will help to pick up what Tom said about the importance of keeping our people together, holding the people of God during this time and on into the future. And again, just to emphasise, I think, as Matthew said, the importance of not being afraid to think about, within the context of the guidance and the importance of keeping everyone safe, what does a realistic local solution look like where you are?
Good, thank you very much. Well, I think it's probably right for us now to move to part 3 of the conversation, which is medical issues. And this is Charlie's going to come in, pragmatic and rational bases for decision making, leading to the right decisions for the right scenario. So we need sort of really good advice at this point about what the expectations might be and how we can move towards opening up and choirs operating again and so on. But there are other things which we ought to be thinking about, which is what about an organist and people just singing in church, or an organist playing for a service but without people singing? Who knows? Is that an interim thing? We'll come back to that. But Charlie, have you got things to say to us about the basic, the noise and the science?
Sure. So I think the first thing I'd say is there's been an enormous amount of noise around the science itself here. I know it sounds like the boring scientist in me that suggests that scientists are probably the best people to talk about science. And if we look through a lot of the media coverage, there's been a lot of coverage of conjecture and of sort of, frankly, scare stories about the science of singing. And actually the reality is that we're not at a position really at the moment in the scientific community to come down in any definitive way on whether, or indeed on whether coronavirus will be transmitted through aerosol. And I'll come on to that in a moment, and indeed whether there is actually a substantially increased risk from singing. And from that, it's therefore quite difficult to form a risk assessment because the underlying science is required in order to fully risk assess. So I think a lot of people have talked about scientific oversight, and I think it's absolutely essential that any models that are formed have at least been reviewed by people who understand the underlying science. And I know that's part of the plan for any models that we'd be looking at to put forward to the Church of England's recovery group. So I think that's really important. I think that's essential. And my own plug, I feel that it would actually be very helpful for the Church of England to take on that kind of scientific oversight, or to form a scientific oversight or advisory body to look at most of their guidelines that they're producing. because I think this both helps with government's confidence in our decision making, but also helps in giving a level of confidence to people who are going to be implementing these guidelines. So one thing that people have spoken about a lot is the relationship of influenza to coronavirus. And I think one thing I'd like to say is they're different diseases. They perform in different ways. They seem to infect people differently, and we can't directly take data from previous infections and apply it to coronavirus. So there is, at the moment, there's been lots of reports of singers having caught coronavirus in large numbers, and the conjecture is, well, that's come from one individual in that group. Now, even if that is the case, we don't actually have any evidence that the singing itself has spread the disease. So whilst you might have one person actually spreading the disease themselves, if we believe that is what happened, we don't know that that's actually spread through the singing, or whether that's spread through touching of similar surfaces, sharing of food, sharing of close quarters, speaking after the event, going out to dinner, who knows. So of course it's possible that coronavirus is spread through aerosol transmission, and there are two forms of transmission which is probably worth just very briefly thinking about. One of them is droplets, which is the larger droplets. So in your sort of 5+ microns in size, which is very small, but not absolutely small, because the absolutely small ones are the aerosols. And the aerosols are so small that they hang in the air for a bit longer than the droplets. So if you cough on me, your droplet may well hit me straight away. And if you cough at me, but you're not close enough, that droplet will fall onto the floor and will sit there. And these are the droplets and the disease which we think sits on surfaces, and on the hardest surfaces up to about 72 hours, although that won't be the case for all surfaces and probably doesn't include things like paper. So in cardboard, it's much lower than that. And then there's aerosols, and these are things which are much smaller and might hang around in the air for longer. And this is where a lot of the fear has come. So the 2-meter rule for avoiding droplets would be that if you're 2 meters away from someone, your chance of getting a droplet in an outdoor space is pretty low. Whereas if you're closer, it's a bit higher. With aerosols, we think that would probably be a longer distance. So if you're even within 4 or 5 meters of someone, you might get an aerosol contamination on you, and you might breathe it in. And the argument is because singers, if they're singing properly, and I remember my choir boy training here, if you're singing properly and using your diaphragm, you might be forcing more of those aerosol droplets out into the environment. But there is no evidence at the moment that, or certainly the evidence is very mixed and has not been definitive, that aerosol is actually a mode of transmission of coronavirus. So a lot of what we're doing is assessing risk as opposed to using definitive science. So whereas we pretty much know that droplets are involved, and certainly the government advice at the moment suggests that droplets is the primary mode of transmission, we're not clear about aerosols. Droplets are pretty easy to avoid. You stand around that 2 meters away, certainly outside, perhaps a bit further inside, and you clean both surfaces and your hands. And if you do so, you will avoid the great majority of transmission through droplets. Aerosols are a bit more tricky to talk about. So we're not sure if aerosols are the cause of this virus, or indeed the transmission, of this virus. So what we need to do in terms of forming risk assessments is, based on the limited science that we have, we need to produce risk assessment that is reasonable. And I think the phrase earlier that was used was pragmatic and rational. And that gets, 2 thumbs up from me. Pragmatic, rational, safe whilst permissive advice. And that means that advice is going to be different in different circumstances. So flexibility for me is one of the key things here. It's not nice to have flexibility, it's key, because then that underpins a proper scientific understanding of how to do risk assessment. And also because as we change over time, and as the science will change, which it will, we're then able to reassess and re-implement our assessments of risk. So there have been lots of questions. I've been trying to follow some of them, but some of the questions that have come through are things like, is it safe? And I'm afraid the answer is, we don't know. But what we'd like to say is, from what we know, the following measures can be put in place, which would be more safe. And the following things we would advise against, depending on the individual circumstances. Now, that's a risk assessment. That's not a scientific study, but there are various of them around. I know one that a lot of people have used has been one from the University of Freiburg, and I'd be happy to share these links with people afterwards. There's also a centre at St Catherine's in Cambridge, St Catherine's College, called the BioRisk Centre, which looks at similar issues, not specific to singing, but looks at the underlying advice which is being given in terms of social distancing. And there are also other organisations. So the Church of Scotland, the Episcopal Church of Scotland has come up with a scientific advisory group that will be looking at this advice. That will be producing very helpful documents, and I think we should be plagiarising at will of all of these different risk assessments that are being done, whilst recognising that they're risk assessments and may be specific to particular instances, or maybe so general that you also need to do your own risk assessments. The other question that's been asked has been about the Department for Education. So if schools are allowed to sing, indeed, if kids are being encouraged to sing in school as part of their mental well-being, amongst other things, and their development, surely we should be adopting similar risk assessments for our churches. And of course, there are things about cleaning and so on, which often rear their head. But ultimately, we need to start asking ourselves serious questions if we're able to, or encouraging children to sing in school, but we're saying that it's too dangerous in churches. I think we need to be very careful if we say things like that, because I'm not sure that's completely accurate. 3 very final specific things, if it's okay. One is about congregational singing. The feeling now on a sort of international risk assessment basis is that congregational singing is probably fine. So much of the statements in the press have been saying, Germany shut down congregational singing. This is true, but that was from weeks ago. And the science on this is changing, the risk assessments on this is changing. And we mustn't simply stop something because someone else did it 3 weeks ago. That's not how to do a good risk assessment, as any risk assessment would do in anywhere. Pipe organs, no evidence whatsoever that they spread disease any more than any other organ would spread disease. So electric organ, pipe organ, you go for it, knock yourselves out. There is really no good reason at this stage not to use pipe organs. The other question that's come in has been outdoor services. So the advice from the government on the 2-metre rule is based on being outside. And I can't pull the figures off the top of my head, but it's something like if you are outside for a minute at 2 meters, it's equivalent to being at 1 meter for 6 seconds in terms of the risk of transmission. So actually outdoor services, and I can't remember the legality of this, and I had a long and boring argument with somebody about it yesterday, but outdoor services may be an answer, or at least part of the answer, because being outside, even the risk that we think is there would be reduced. So that's a sort of brief foray through where we are. I'm sorry I can't give you a definitive answer, but the science is changing, and a lot of this will change as we move on, and that's why flexibility is so key to any risk assessments that we're doing.
So, Charlie, there are some particular points here which are quite encouraging for organists, for example, musicians, that an organist can certainly go in to a church, you'd have thought, and practice the organ.
I'm not a bishop of the Church of England, so it's not for me to say that. There are Church of England buildings, but I would agree in terms of if we're managing the cleaning, which also does not need to be deep cleaning. It needs to be simple detergent cleaning, and that information is all on the government advice websites. But if we're able to clean effectively, and we're able to ensure that we're not touching lots of surfaces and passing it on that way, there's really no good reason scientifically to say that an organist is more dangerous than a priest.
Okay, so Hugh Morris is going to make a comment, and then the Bishop Christopher, I'll ask him whether you'd like to make a comment as well.
If I could just pick up this issue about the organist, because I know lots of people are asking, we've had some questions submitted in advance and during the session about can organists practice? Is an organist practicing, in fact, private prayer, and therefore covered by the things the Archbishop and the Bishop were talking about earlier? What might be helpful, if maybe Matthew and others would be, or maybe the Bishop in a minute could pick up, is that there is thought going into making that possible for organists to go back into church to practice, bearing in mind the current position of the church is that that isn't possible, but they are deeply aware that that is an issue and does need to be addressed, and they are listening to it. It is not falling on deaf ears. I think it's important that people are aware that that's the case, and it might be that there are others who wish to pick up that who are in a bit better position than I.
I think we'll ask the Bishop to comment, and then perhaps Matthew might come in as well.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. Yes, these things are all under active consideration at the moment. Clearly, we're in a changing situation where we need to respond first to what the government is telling us the rules are, the regulations are, and then on that basis determine what's possible, to be as freeing as we can while ensuring that people are kept safe. For instance, simply to say, yes, you can go in and play the organ, while there are still considerations around ensuring that there's nobody else in the building at the same time, that there's a reasonable gap. There are various practical implications that are really important to work through. But as Hugh indicates, we are actively working at all of this. And if I may say so, there's also other groups of people for whom their contribution to church life, to the beauty of what happens in the church building, also have to be considered as well. There are issues about bell ringers, about flower arrangers, about altar servers, and it's important that we recognise that we are a Christian community, looking to do the best we can for our own community, but at the same time serving the needs of our parishes, of the people of our communities. But the work is underway and proceeding.
Good. Matthew, and then the Archbishop, I think. Yes, Matthew.
That's all beautifully said, Bishop Christopher, but I also wanted to mention the fact that everyone's very aware that in order for organs to be played, people need to practice, and so if we're likely to be having whether the organ played in public worship or indeed in the context of weddings, which may precede larger gatherings, you're going to have to allow musicians to be in the building to get a sense of what the organ is like and prepare registrations and so on and so forth. And that's all also, we're deeply aware of that. The other point is young people and learning the organ, and the fact that if you get out of the habit of doing it, it's awfully difficult to get back on the wagon again. So that's also a key point.
Right, a lot of people would want to have their funerals in church as well. I mean, not just weddings, but funerals, which might precede other things happening on. But Archbishop George, if you've got something. Yeah.
Same question to Charlie from me, and that is, Charlie, you mentioned levels of cleaning, etc., etc. And then you mentioned a website, and I didn't manage to get the name down. I'd be very interested in having it.
Sure, I think I was probably referring to the government website that explains how to look after public buildings. I'm happy to collate sort of the information that I've got access to, which is all public information, that are as part of possibly a follow-up to this, but I'm also happy just to send it across to you.
That's very helpful, thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Hugh, you'd like to make a comment?
Yeah, I'm sorry to keep jumping in, John. It's just to make sure that people, just to try and say that. So, for instance, these websites, that what we'll do, because of the quantity of information that's coming out here, we will collate it and we will circulate to the list of all the attendees, which of course the system logs, so that you can have, for instance, the links that Charlie's talking about. So if you're thinking, I can't write that down, I can't remember what they said, I can't find it, fear not, we will summarize it and we will share it, if that helps.
It's going to be a major piece of work, I think, out of this. There are 162 comments have been made so far, and I'm delighted that people are making comments. It's very helpful indeed. I think it's probably time for us to move, unless, Sal, did you want to add something to what we've been talking about so far?
No, I'm happy to move on, John.
Okay, so I think we're going to move now to the fourth area.
John, I'm sorry to be a pain. Is it worth just mentioning? People have mentioned in some of the comments, and as around some of this issue has been the mental health of choristers and of those who would normally use music as one of their ways of strategies of coping, for want of a better phrase. I think that has to be recognised, and it is something that's being recognised by the Church of England, certainly in the conversations we've been having with them. I'm sorry, together, that we've been having. but there is help on a particularly useful piece of kit at the moment, and I'll put this again in the list of links, is something called Every Mind Matters, which the NHS has raised and has put up as part of the response to this crisis. And it does actually have both practical advice that you can use, age-specific practical advice if you're worried about choristers and so on, but also gives access into particular forms of therapy that might be helpful for people if people feel that they need to be signposted to them. So I just wanted to raise that, you know, it's tough, and this uncertainty is really tough, particularly for children, and Every Mind Matters has been a really helpful piece of advice that's come out from the NHS.
Of course, if it is the case that a lot of children are going back to school on the 1st of June, then it'll be quite normal, really, to have choirs. But that's another side issue. Well, we do move then to the fourth area, which is understanding the consequences of the current situation and ministering to it. Financial thinking and people as individuals. How does a person contribute from his own or her own strength and their knowledge? What is a church community looking like, with or without church musicians? Can we envisage that? Well, clearly we think that music is a fundamentally important part of the life of the worship of Almighty God, and needs to be enabled. Sal, you've got some comments to make in this area.
Thank you, John. I think really the first thing we wanted to do this afternoon was just acknowledge, before we go any further, that this is a really traumatic time for church musicians, and I don't use that term lightly. We know that for many church musicians, the speed at which things have changed has been really disruptive and dislocating, and I think one of the things we need to do is acknowledge that, and that obviously takes time to assimilate and recover from. Many of our church musicians have had part of their identity removed, and I say that because church musicians have said that to me. And it picks up on the stuff Charlie's just talked about the importance of music for well-being. So I think one of the things we need to be aware of in the church is our pastoral responsibility to those people who do provide music for us, and the way we need to look after them and continue to try to nurture and encourage them in this very strange and difficult time. There are some practical ways we might do that, like keeping in contact, an email, a phone call, whatever. And I think also the other thing that I'm picking up from church musicians I speak to is how much they are valuing at the moment honest conversation. You know, not pretending that this is not a difficult time, because it is, and not pretending that we're going back to where we were, because they know, as we do, that even if only in the short term, that's not the case. So being honest in our conversations with musicians. Also, I think reassuring church musicians that they are still needed and that they are very much part of the thinking that's going on now. David touched on that earlier on, saying there are conversations going on at all sorts of levels and in all sorts of places, and music is very much a part of that. And the RSCM is trying very hard to make sure that we are represented in those conversations, so that the perspective and the importance and the future of music is not lost in these conversations. We can also, of course, keep working with musicians. Those of us who are preparing online worship need the expertise and the help of our musicians to enhance what we're offering. So again, conversations, communication, listening and sharing ideas. And perhaps most important, being clear that there is a future beyond this, and even if we can't quite see what it is, to be clear that we believe it's coming and that music and our musicians will be a part of that. I'm taking them with us, as Tom said, not leaving people behind, not leaving people outside the family of the church at the moment. So communication, flexibility, planning together and thinking about the future together, I think, are key.
Thank you very much. Now, I just on the financial position, I think it would be very interesting whether the Bishop or the Archbishop would like to make any comment about how the church is coping, as it were, financially, and what the prospects are after this period of lockdown. Will we have enough money to be able to employ organists and to keep them going? I mean, or is it going to be, a terrible time? Bishop Christopher.
I certainly hope we can employ organists, employ musicians, enjoy the music that does make such a significant contribution to our worship and life, and will continue to do so into the future. You're inviting me to look into a crystal ball, which I can't do. The finances of churches vary enormously. Some are reliant on letting income in halls substantially, others on major significant fundraising events which haven't happened this year, and we don't know when they'll be able to return. There are significant financial challenges. How that will be come the autumn and into next year, I'm afraid I simply can't say, except to say that the nurturing of our worship is fundamental to our calling as Christians, but the shape of that is impossible to predict at this stage.
Bishop, there's been quite a lot of talk about not needing church buildings anymore, that people can worship in their homes, and why do they need to come together? Have you got anything you want to comment on that area?
I think the coming together of a Christian community to worship, to learn, to engage, to enjoy fellowship is pretty fundamental. When I was a child, I used to think I was a pretty good footballer when I stood in front of a wall and kicked a ball against it and trapped it and kicked it back. You know, I discovered the beautiful game when I was playing with other people. And the same is true of the Christian life, that actually it's when we engage together. Now, you can do some of that on Zoom or through video conferencing, particularly with people you already know. But the Christian church is called to reach out, to engage new people, and that one of the ways we'll want to continue to do that is in and from our buildings.
Thank you very much. Archbishop, would you like to add a comment to that?
I'd like to reiterate what Christopher has just said there and link it with the comments that Sal made about the welfare, mental health even, feelings of insecurity of choristers and musicians. And there's no doubt that one of the major issues that's been thrown up in all of this is the mental health of people who feel isolated from each other. Not just that they can't visit their families, which they can't, of course, social isolation, etc., but the loneliness factor. And in a funny old way, I think the communion of the church and the community of the church and the worship which is expressed by all sorts of people, not just as individuals, but as part of the body of Christ, is an example and a witness that barriers can be broken down. But can I speak to the Dean of Westminster on our favourite subject, which is, of course, finance?
The Dean of Westminster.
And I read St Paul's Cathedral thing there a moment ago, and that's very, very interesting. I think the days of us depending on Sunday collections and the level of giving from reducing congregations, I think those days have gone. And this has just, as it were, pointed that up more than anything else. You know, the casual giving of casual amounts of money with no commitment, those days have gone. Again, I come back to the streaming. In the churches that are streaming in this diocese, and this is a poor diocese, Wales is a poor area, as you know, but the number of innovative priests who have put up, dare I use the word, advertisements, will you make your usual offering their standing order? It's gone down very well. You have to do it sort of tastefully and perhaps discreetly, but it's gone down very well. People are used to this language now. will you donate by credit card? People are doing that. In a number of our churches, we're experimenting now with touch points. When you come in or go out, will you touch this point and donate 5, 10 or 25 pounds? It's working. We were very nervous about putting advertisements on live stream, etc., strap lines, the need to support this endeavour. But from every other charity, if you like, and many other organizations, I think people are used to this electronic way of dealing with money. If we are courageous enough to put forward the commitment that we have made to worship, to fellowship, to pastoral care, this is all good news.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to ask Tom and then David to make a comment, and then perhaps Sal and Hugh, in that order.
Thank you. Picking up on Sal's points about well-being, which were really powerful and important. There's a huge workforce of our musicians who are on flimsy contracts, or even non-existent ones at best, who the church has found it very easy to do away with. And I'm aware of a number of church musicians who've been made redundant in recent weeks. There's also a huge body of furloughed singers and staff who feel at a loss, and there's going to have to be a huge effort to bridge build just to restore trust in the church, and also their confidence in themselves. So this is going to be an ongoing issue, and it really needs to be at the top of our agenda. And just a practical suggestion about choristers and keeping in touch and feel engaged is the idea of having a phone tree, so that people can be in touch, one chorister to another, which is quite fun, a sort of rota basis, just to keep that conversation going. And that may, of course, go for furloughed musicians as well, keeping them in the loop and letting them know what the plans are for our ministry going forward. And another point is furloughed musicians feel stuck because they can't communicate with their choirs. They're not legally able to do that. So the church needs to think about creative ways of handling that. I'm not sure about an immediate solution, but it does need to be very high on our national agenda.
So Tom, when would you expect at St George in the East to get going again with choir and music and so on?
Well, we're still running rehearsals with the children every week on Zoom and through the holidays to keep the pack together. We are having digital services at which people are able to sing. We have an organist who's playing the piano as people join a Zoom call and as they end. And we're able to offer a reduced rate because it is a shorter time, it's a half-hour service, but we're able to honour about 75% of the fees for that musician. I think I mentioned earlier the idea of having more masses during the week. So if we only were able, say, to have 20 people, then that might require us to have staggered masses. Well, that's an opportunity for engaging musicians and bringing them in, and maybe musicians we wouldn't normally turn to, and encouraging them to develop their ministry in our churches too.
Thank you very much, David. David.
Yes, I'm aware that not everybody has paid musicians from the group that's listening today, but obviously there's still a large proportion that do. I mean, if we've learned nothing else about lockdown, we've all worked out, whether we're church or not, of faith or not, that music has helped get people through this. And an awful lot of it, not all of it, but an awful lot of it has been church music. So we owe a huge debt to all the musicians that have put effort into music in the last years, especially the stuff that's been laid down on CDs and amateur recordings, because certainly from my point of view, we've been churning this out all the time for online worship. So I think we can all take solace from the fact that people have realized that music is important. But yes, this is just as hard in a sense as the bit about what can we do in church. It's going to be how we can do it. I mean, the Useley Trust and the Friends of Cathedral Music have just launched an appeal for money to try and top up where places are struggling in churches and cathedrals, and they worked out that £1 million a month gets invested in local areas through cathedrals and parish church music. £1 million a month. That's an extraordinary investment, and we want to get back to that level at some stage. But it's going to involve a lot of creative thinking. I think the more, as is one of the comments I made earlier on, the more you think about how you can model what you think it might look like in your church when you go back, the easier it is for us to get back to some kind of normal. And again, the guidance will help with that, but it is, I'm afraid, going to be just as much to people in their own locality as to how they do it. But I think thinking and planning is really important, and I would encourage you to talk to each other, talk to any of the panelists that are on here today. You can find us all via websites and Twitter and whatever, and we'll do what we can to help sail through this particular storm.
Good, thank you very much. Noel, you'd like to make a comment?
Obviously, during this lockdown period, musicians have not known how long it's going to go on. And in true British bulldog spirit, I think most have risen to the occasion and thought, well, this might be an exciting thing to do in terms of recording my track, sitting in front of my laptop, singing my part, playing my instrument. What is unknown, of course, is if this then stretches into months and years ahead, how much that commitment. Clearly, there's been a development in technology, and musicians themselves, certainly younger musicians, have acquired all sorts of skills over the years that maybe the church has not really been tapping into or utilizing. And then suddenly, actually, we're finding these musicians, singers, are very keen to lock themselves in their room and play with their remote devices to record themselves. A lot of us as well rely on old archive material, and obviously that is true of certain cathedrals and certain churches where recordings have been made in the past, which you've been able to play online. But clearly, the recording of the here and now in people's homes for worship Sunday by Sunday has been a huge development and an experience for many people as they perfected the skills that maybe they didn't have particularly in great array originally. So I think people have enjoyed the experience, but always thinking this isn't going to last forever. What happens now is this thinking of shutting yourself, making time commitment to do some recording, as well as, okay, time to at last get back together again in a live situation, how much that will pall and how much we can rely on that continuing into the future.
Good, thank you, Noel. Hugh. Need to unmute you.
Sorry, I've just been trying to keep abreast of some of the flow of this, and the questions coming in is so it's such a large body of them now that what I'm going to make sure is that there's a shared way of the panel being able to we will put together a way that we can assemble a considered body of responses.
We've got just 10 minutes.
10 minutes, yes. So there's a few things that might just be helpful to say. There's a few people consistently saying, and I might invite you to ask Charlie to speak in a minute, John, about some more technical scientific things about the way about getting.
I'll do that,
but there are the request about, well, what kind of music might we look to use, and there's some suggestions coming in as well as questions on the questions feed that we might consider the role of organ masses, the role of simple rounds, the role of chants, the role of instruments being played in church. All of that we will assemble and put together in some coordinated documents going out. That's not to say that's not the same as assembling groups of singers, which of course is what many people are keen to do, and I think Charlie might have something to say about that in a minute. If I could just say the other thing, that there's a lot of questions coming in about licensing and CCLI streaming and one license. The RSCM website does have information on that, and there are specific rules that you can't do. You might be aware of the initiative, and Matthew might pick this up in a minute, that we've done with working with the Church of England and St Martin in the Field to supply a body of hymns that can be used by churches in streaming each week. If you as a church don't have the resources to do some of this online stuff, they're working really well. Many of you have talked about what can we do about connecting with our singers. I think there's an observation coming that perhaps the main thing is that people do some singing. It doesn't necessarily matter that it's not the same singing as usual, but it's something that they continue to do. That you can do that, including encouraging people to sing along. Not least, the RSCM every day we put a hymn of the day for our on our website. as well as some of these other ones from St Martin in the Fields. I'm also just going to ask Sam in a moment to share, I think he's got to say, particularly for choristers, we've been putting a lot of effort into moving forward at great speed, the Shodi app, which you can log into our, there we go, thank you, Sam. And it's something that is focused around our the awards that choristers can take, but it's open at the moment to anybody. And again, look on our website around this, you can find it, all of the links on the homepage, that shows that you can, that there are worksheets to keep choristers engaged, there are ways you can practice oral tests, there are ways that you can do some singing with some rehearsal tracks of various things, and we're continuing to populate that as fast as we can. So some of these things, thank you Sam, particularly at the Bronze Awards, because we're starting at Bronze and doing these things, but it's important to know that some of that stuff is there and that you can turn to, and I would encourage people to do that, so that anything that you can do to keep your singers engaged is a really helpful thing to do, because better that than that they drift away. So the art of the possible remains the thing to hold on to, I think. So John, may I suggest that Charlie's got some things to say, I think, in response to some of the questions coming in?
Charlie, have you spotted some of the questions, and have you got some particular responses?
Yeah, I've got a couple of very particular things to say, really. I mean, one of the things that has struck me through this is a lot of people are talking about Zoom and new ways of doing music, but I think we need to also recognise that there's a desire amongst a lot of people to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and to not lose so much of what's so wonderful about the choral tradition and musical tradition of different traditions in the churches and in this country, and because that forms part of the liturgy and the worship of the church. And I think that has been picked up by the Church of England, that this is not an add-on. This is a fundamental part in many ways and in many places to the worship of the church. So I think I'm in favour of thinking of new ways outside the box, but of course most choirs will do best doing what they do best in the way they do it best, because that's why they do it that way. And I think we mustn't lose sight of the idea that actually if we can get back to that kind of position, that is a good thing. So I think we need to just keep that in mind. I know there's been some questions about access to good information on the science that's out there, and I can't pull a rabbit out the hat, I'm afraid, and produce a brilliant depository of all this information. But I think this is key, and I think this is something that the Church of England and possibly that the RSCM will be able to help with. I think one of the big questions is about masks. Should masks be worn? So the study about the risk assessment on congregational singing has taken into account that masks would be worn in Germany. In the UK, for cultural, but also for some scientific reasons, masks haven't been advised in all situations. Although if you take the suggestion of going into supermarkets and wearing masks where you need to, I can see that very easily translating across into going into enclosed spaces like churches. I think we have a real responsibility here as the Church of England and as singers and as central bodies to speak scientifically when we talk about science, and to not claim things are scientific when they're not. And I think one of the big concerns that's come through some of this debate, not today, but in the debate more generally about the closing of churches and so on, has been that things that are not scientific have been declared scientific, or science, or sort of this idea that there's some science which justifies particular decisions, has not always been correct. Now, of course, science may lead to increased, or there may be a concern that the science suggests a greater risk in a particular area, but we need to be really, really clear about what is based on science and what is based on an underlying assessment of the risk of that science in a particular environment. So I think particularly and I say this as an ordinand, and I may never get hands on head and ordained for saying so, but I think that our bishops need to be really, really careful about when they give advice to dioceses, when they say, and what they say that advice is based on. Now, if it's based on a risk assessment that the diocese has made or that the bishop has made, that's fine. But we shouldn't be talking about science. We shouldn't say that something is based on science when it's not. So a lot of the conversations today have been about flexibility. So we might have cathedral choirs able to do things in different parts of the building, maybe within 1 metre or 2 metres of each other. Maybe we could have choirs in the choir of a large church or a cathedral where they're able to stay in the same stall, always use that stall, reduce the risk of passing on through droplet formation. There are really interesting ways of doing this, but the key beneath this is flexibility. And I think that's one of the things that the RSCM, amongst others, will be able to do, is modelling serious ideas that have been reviewed in the context of the science by people who know what they're talking about, to identify these as genuinely possible, and not only possible, but also desirable as we move forward.
Thank you, Charlie, very much. We've got 5 minutes now. I just want to say that it's wonderful to have so many people from around the world. We've got people from RSCM choirs and other choirs in the United States, in Australia, New Zealand, as well as across the United Kingdom. Matthew, I think you wanted to make some additional comment to what Charlie's just been saying.
I just wanted to say that what Charlie has mentioned about not propagating information that we don't know is true is probably a very good one in the present climate. It's really important not to hypothesize on the basis of things that we don't have the answers for. We're going to do our very, very best to provide whatever information that we have as quickly as we possibly can, to provide as much flexibility dependent on the conditions and on the government guidance. For people who are interested in information about organs and maintenance, there's a very detailed document on the Church of England website talking about the maintenance of church buildings, of which the organs are a part, and that document will be kept up to date on the basis of what's possible under the present guidance.
Good, thank you. I'm going to ask Hugh in a moment, and then the Bishop, Bishop Christopher, just to finish us off with perhaps with a prayer at the end. Hugh.
Two things, then, if I may. First of all, Matthew might just like to respond briefly about of course, there's a difference between, and people are wanting clarification, I think, between the difference between checking that your organ works and that the blower doesn't fuse the building when you turn it on, and actually being able to play and practice some music. And Matthew, it'd be really helpful, I think, just to clarify the current position as you understand it, so that people are in the clearest mind on that. And if the Bishop's going to close in prayer, it would be inopportune for me to jump in after that point to point out that the Archbishop talked about the ways of online giving and so forth. Can I just say to all of the audience that this webinar, we were given some money to make it happen free. However, we've had to expand the capacity so much that actually the costs of us have really risen on doing it. If you're able to send, and Sam will put up the text number in a minute, even just a small amount via text giving or via our website, it will mean that we can keep doing all of this stuff, which we desperately need to be able to do to help people. We can't run on thin air. We actually need a little bit of wonga. So we appreciate the financial support. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I will pass back to Matthew.
So a brief word from Matthew, and then finally the Bishop. Yeah.
As I understand it at this point in time, practicing the organ isn't constituted as an essential activity, although organ maintenance is. If that position changes, we will be sure to let you know.
Let's encourage that it should. Thank you very much. And Bishop, a final word, a blessing perhaps.
Thank you. Can I, as we close, thank all those who've contributed by their presence in this conversation and this conference, not just the panelists, but all those who contributed in so many ways. So conscious that we're scattered around the world, but that we have come together today, let us pray. Lord our God, you call us as your people to love you in worship and in witness, in service and in proclamation. Help us to continue to be faithful, to offer our best gifts to your service and in your name. We pray through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating. The time has come for us to finish, but bless you all. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.